Lawyer Xi Yang was tortured for the better part of 2 years because he dared to represent China's poor and persecuted. The account of his detention is both harrowing and horrible. Xi Yang was sleep-deprived and kept in isolation. Squads of police punched and kicked him for hours at a time. He was forced to sit for hours on a precarious stack of plastic chairs, his feet dangling painfully off the ground. Police made threats to his wife and children and said that they would turn him into an invalid unless he confessed to political crimes. Xi Yang and his fellow human rights lawyers wanted the best for China, but what they got was the very worst. Since July of 2015, almost 250 lawyers and legal assistants were detained, sending a chilling message to those fighting for legal reforms and for elemental human rights. We are here today to shine a bright light on the brutal, illegal, and dehumanizing use of torture and forced disappearance of human rights lawyers and rights advocates in China. We shine a light on dictatorships because nothing good happens in the dark. And as we will learn today, there are some very, very dark places in China. Chinese officials repeatedly tell us, and they tell me all the time, that I should focus more on the positive aspects of China and not dwell so much on the negative. That is a difficult task when you read Xi Yang's story or read Gao Zhejiang's account of his torture, and his wife and his daughter previously have testified before our subcommittee, or read the account of many other very, very brave women and men who are standing up for human rights in China. It's a difficult task when you look at Li Chunfu and his brother Li Heping. These are some of China's best and bravest and brightest, and now women and men with broken bodies, shattered minds, broken noses and faces, men and women who have aged 20 or more years after just 2 years or 3 of solitary confinement or torture. It is shocking, offensive, immoral, barbaric, and inhumane. It is also completely possible that Chinese officials believe the international community will not hold them to account. While President Xi Jinping feels feted at Davos and lauded in national capitals for his public commitments to openness, his government is torturing and abusing those seeking rights guaranteed by China's own constitution and, of course, its international obligations. One Oxford University scholar said that Xi Jinping has built the, quote, perfect dictatorship, an increasingly repressive garrison state that avoids any international censure. Through the United Nations and the sanctions available in the Global Magnitsky Act, however, we should be seeking to hold accountable any Chinese officials complicit in torture, human rights abuses, and illegal detentions. Xi Yang identified at least 10 police officers who tortured him. We have a list of those officers who he has named. They need to be investigated by the administration and sanctions meted out individually to these individuals who have visited such horror and cruelty upon him. We are in the process of gathering names of others as well. I, as chairman of this committee, will send those names to President Trump, Secretary of State Tillerson, UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, and the chairs and ranking members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, pursuant again to the Magnitsky Act protocol. We will seek UN investigations into the torture of Chinese human rights lawyers and human rights defenders. You know, as we all know, on several occasions, the Special Rapporteur for Torture has looked into the use of torture in China and has found it to be absolutely systematic. If you're arrested and you're a religious prisoner or you're a political prisoner, a prisoner of conscience, you will be tortured. And you will be tortured with depravity and with utter cruelty. We know that this also violates China's obligations as a signatory to the UN Torture Convention. Where's the enforcement? We will also seek investigations under the Global Magnitsky Act, as I said. I introduced the House version of that bill, which was signed into law last year. That law explicitly, and it says explicitly, that any foreign government officials who engages in or is complicit in torture can be sanctioned by denying entry visas into the United States or by imposing financial sanctions. Those who tortured Xi Yang and Li Heping should never benefit from access to the United States or to our financial system. We will hear testimony today from some of the wives who have suffered. You know, when a political or prisoner of conscience is sent off to jail and suffers, it's not just that dissident who suffers. It is the wives, the families, the extended families. Very often they're rounded up as well and interrogated and beaten. You know, we have the great Chen Quanzhen in our audience today and his wife Wei Jing. When Chen suffered the barbarity of the Chinese dictatorship for speaking up on behalf of women who have been coerced into forced abortions in Lingyi, he suffered in prison, then under house imprisonment, but his wife and his children also suffered and showed incredible bravery during that entire terrible ordeal. But he persevered, he persisted, and today is now free and speaks out very boldly and effectively on behalf of human rights abuses in China. Pastor Bob Fu, who will be doing much of the translation today, or some of the translation, he too was incarcerated as a prisoner of conscience. But again, he persisted along with his wife as well and found their way to freedom and now speaks out boldly as leader of China Aid. Finally, we'll hear from many fear that Mr. Li and Li Mingzi, his wife, will also be providing testimony to us today. After entering mainland China in March of this year for a personal trip, Mr. Li went missing for 10 days before the Chinese officials confirmed that he was being held on so-called national security grounds. Let me just say, we all know this. What a joke. People ask for human rights protections, and they're accused of national security violations. I mean, it just doesn't pass the straight face test, and it's about time that subterfuge and that lie, that big lie, is fully done away with and exposed. Many fear that Mr. Li is being detained under a harsh new Chinese law to monitor and control foreign-funded NGOs, enforced earlier this year as part of a crackdown on civil society. As some of you may know, I also chair the China Commission along with Marco Rubio, and every year we put out a very extensive account of the human rights abuse in China. One of the big changes, worsening changes, there are many, is the fact that the NGOs are now being, who had very limited freedom to begin with, have far less now, just as religious organizations and denominations are also being cracked down by this cruel dictatorship. Politically, let me just conclude by saying that we welcome the testimony of these wives. I hope and I pray, and we will monitor to ensure that because they have spoken out boldly and in an open forum like today, that any further retaliation against their husbands or any members of their families will be watched closely. And Xi Jinping will be noticed, and I do hope the Trump administration will be bold and effective, as well as Secretary Tillerson, in raising individual cases, because when you raise the individual cases, obviously it helps all the others as well. I yield to Mr. Castro.